At the outset, I'd like to thank Vice Chancellor Joan Prince for her excellent work in organizing our panel and convening this first event today. Joan, thank you very much for your work on this. Today marks an important inaugural event, one that for our campus will kick off a year-long series and provides a platform for civil discourse for students, faculty, staff, and others in our community around free speech, freedom of expression. These are among the top issues being discussed on campuses nationwide and in communities. In fact, just today, Professor Enrique showed me an article in the New York Times, and Professor Figueroa, when we just took a look at that, I think the headline, correct me if I'm wrong, front story of the New York Times today is that Attorney General Jeff Sessions takes aim at campus speech. Is that a pretty close approximation for that? This is today. This is real time. So nothing could be much more relevant in terms of the timeliness. There are additional events, student projects, and related programming sponsored by the faculty and departments that are part of this series. And we've had a campus committee working on this with faculty, students, and staff over the last several months that have been planning these events. There's a freedom of expression website that we have. It's uwm.edu/freedom-expression. So once again, uwm.edu/freedom-expression. Of special note is a student-generated symposium for a World Cafe style that will be held in the spring semester, as well as a TEDx event later this fall. The planning team here is led by Warren Scherer of our Inclusive Excellence Center. Thank you, Warren, in advance for your work on that. In today's society, we have seen an erosion of civility and openness to hear ideas. Our role as educated citizens in a democratic society includes a responsibility to respectfully and thoughtfully address issues with which we disagree, or may not agree at all. Free speech is not about screaming at one another when we disagree. It's not about shutting down those with opposing opinions. Free speech is a right and it must be protected. Especially at UWM and other academic institutions, we have an unwavering commitment to inclusivity, civility, equity, and respect. As a public university, we will always be a forum for the free exchange of ideas, even if some of those ideas are disagreeable, even abhorrent, and challenging our thinking in sometimes terribly uncomfortable ways. This is not easy. There are difficulties and sensitivities with balancing free speech and speech that marginalizes, as I think we will talk about in depth today. This series, though, will help us in terms of developing and providing strategies, techniques, and opportunities to move discourse in a direction that is in fact civil, inclusive of all, and in alignment with our values and the dignity of our campus. So this is our opportunity to set the stage around civil discourse, differing opinions, and how we use our teaching, learning, and research agendas in these important discussions. This is a good time for me to now introduce our next speaker. Please welcome Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Johannes Britz. Johannes?
Thank you, Chancellor Moni, and good morning, everybody. As the Chief Academic Officer, I'm delighted. I think we take the lead in many cases in discussing this as an open forum on a campus where we truly believe in freedom of expression, freedom of speech, where we can have a public sphere, where we can exchange our ideas. I'll be very short. I just want to acknowledge the provosts that we invited from the system that are here this morning, in particular Provost John Coker from Oshkosh. I know he is here. And then also my Dean Fellows who are here, colleagues that are here this morning. I want to thank you for taking your time to be here this morning. And also, Joan, thank you for taking the lead in the initiative and also making available many grants for our faculty members to work with our students on freedom of expression on campus. We have 3 awards. Leslie Harris, I don't know if Leslie is here this morning. There she is at the back. And also Bill Keith. I don't know, Bill, if you're here. There's Bill at the back there from English, and Dave Pate from Social Work. Dave, I don't know if you're here this morning, if you could make it. Maybe you're teaching. And then also working with our students on this. And Richard Grusin. Richard, are you here this morning, 21st Century? Oh, he's in Italy. Okay, maybe he thought this morning. But he is also, they have this 50th anniversary of the Center for 21st Century Studies this year. and part of their celebration will actually be around freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the regulation thereof. So I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm looking forward to today, and welcome again. Thank you very much.
Whoa. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you, Chancellor Money and Provost Britz. Just a few logistics and then on to our panel. Please know that this event is being live streamed and will be available for viewing at a later date on our website. And for any reason that you might have to leave the room, we're going to ask that you do so quietly. At this time, it's the only time you get, so if you would check all of your devices and make sure that they are silent, we would appreciate that as well. While there are no live microphones for today's symposium, please know that several of the questions that will be discussed by our panel were actually generated by students, and they're incorporated into the panel discussion. And now, let me introduce the panel. We'll start with Daniel. Daniel Kafka is a UWM student who is one of our military vets. He served 4 years in the Army. He is a political science and Italian major from Milwaukee, and would you please help me welcome him and thank him for his service. Next to Daniel is Dr. Blaine Neufeld. Dr. Neufeld is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research and teaching interests are in political philosophy and ethics. He serves as the director of the Certificate in Ethics, Values, and Society. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and a Master's of Philosophy from the University of Oxford. Dr. Neufeld is the author of several books and publications and is well known and highly respected for his work in political liberalism and education. And he came down from Canada for me just for today, so I'm really appreciative to him. Please welcome Dr. Neufeld. Next to Dr. Neufeld is a familiar face to many of you. Since 1996, Dr. Michelle Bria has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Journey House, a community-based organization on Milwaukee's Near South Side that empowers families to move out of poverty by offering adult education, workforce readiness, youth development, and family engagement programs. Journey House annually serves more than 6,000 children and families at 6 locations. Dr. Bria has received numerous awards for her work in the community. In March 2016, Donald Driver awarded Dr. Bria with the Donald Driver Driven to Achieve Award for her outstanding community efforts. She's one of us. She received her doctoral degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and received her Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Arts from a university across town. How's that for not naming anything? Please welcome Dr. Bria, would you please? The next person behind me, I'll skip for last. So I'm going to skip over to that way. Samuel Rogers. Sam is a junior with a political science and global studies major. He is also a vet, having served 8 years in the Army. He also serves as a Veterans Advocacy Senator for the UWM Student Association, and I would hope that you would welcome him and again thank him for his service to our country. Thank you so much. Next to Sam is Bridget. Bridget Reese is our PhD student in media, cinema, and digital studies. She was feeling a little under the weather, so we're really appreciative that you were able to make it. And what she will bring to the table, and she's asked me to specifically emphasize, is that she also teaches in our LGBT studies. So Bridget, welcome, and if any time you don't feel well, raise your hand, okay? Thank you. Would you welcome Bridget, please? And next to Bridget is Rick. Rick Essenberg is the founder and current president and general counsel of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. It is a conservative, libertarian, public interest law firm headquartered in Milwaukee. Rick is a frequent columnist in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and commentator in both the local and national media. He writes the Culture Con column for Wisconsin Magazine and is a frequent contributor to Right Wisconsin. His work has been featured in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the National Review Online, and U.S. News and World Report. He holds a J.D. magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and a B.A. in political science from, you guessed it, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Please welcome Rick Essenberg. Rick? And since March of this year, Chris Ott has served as the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Wisconsin. He is a Milwaukee native and a graduate of Ozaukee High School in Fredonia and Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Prior to this role, he served as the communications director for the ACLU of Massachusetts in Boston for 10 years. And before that, he led the LGBT rights organization Fair Milwaukee. Would you please help me welcome Chris Ott? And before I introduce our speaker, I would like you also to acknowledge our two sign interpreters this morning. They're so funny. I asked them their names. I got a first name. It's like, no, you were kind of born with a first and last name. So we need to know that, and we really need to thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Jill Kinshaw-Cry. Jill? And Aaron Johnson. Aaron? Thank you. And now, it is my extreme pleasure, before this podium disappears, and it will disappear, have no fear, to introduce our moderator for this morning, actually, Clarence Page. Clarence Page is the 1989 Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary. He has been a columnist and a member of the Chicago Tribune's editorial board since 1984. His column is syndicated nationally by Tribune Media Services in close to 200 papers, and he has been based in Washington, D.C. since 1991. In September of 2014, his latest book, Culture Warriors, Selected Columns, was published by Amazon, so make sure you go online and buy it. Page was a regular panelist on the McLaughlin Group until the passing of the host, John McLaughlin. He serves as a guest panelist on CBS's Face the Nation. He is a regular contributor of essays to PBS NewsHour and has hosted documentaries on the public broadcasting system. He has also participated in a Chicago Tribune task force on vote fraud, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He has received public service awards from Illinois and Wisconsin chapters of the ACLU for his columns educating readers on constitutional rights. He began his journalism career, I think that's important to know, as a freelance writer and photographer for the Middletown Journal and Cincinnati Enquirer at the age of 17. He received his Bachelor of Science in Journalism from Ohio University, and he has also received honorary doctorates from several universities. He is married to the former Lisa Johnson of Chicago, and they have one child. And it is my extreme pleasure to present your panel. Thank you. We're going to have the podium disappear.
And that'll be fine with me, so I can see all of you. Thank you. Hello. Nice to see you. I've been rustling papers like crazy here because this is such a timely topic that more material pops up in the headlines just about every day. I'm reminded of the late great Walter Cronkite, who described TV news as trying to put 100 pounds of information into a 5-pound bag. That's what we're going to do for the next hour here, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to try to move things along as swiftly as possible so you can hear from our magnificent panel here as well. I want to say a few opening words to set the tone of debate and discussion, and then just really have a conversation here about various aspects of what we mean by free speech these days, what is endangering it, and how do we move forward from here. This week, with the Vietnam series on PBS, I've been having flashbacks like crazy to campus life as well as my own military experience, because these same issues were percolating back then. Only then I was arguing with my father, for example, about he felt that we students were going too far with free speech. And you had Mario Savio, of course, out in Berkeley, here back in 1964, who launched what was called the free speech movement. Today, we see Berkeley as a scene of violent protests and counter-protesters fighting over who should be allowed to speak. There's a different kind of a mood in the air now. Now I too am a father. Now I am living the immortal parental curse. Just wait till you have children of your own. Because I have a young 20-something who's in very close friendship with a number of members of Antifa, which, according to Fox News, is second only to cancer and AIDS as a threat to America's future. And he tells me that free speech is apparently a right-wing conservative plot. And I point out to him the glories of the founders, and of course they are dismissed as dead white males, which aren't worthy of entering into the discussion. And as I assured him, well, these are the fathers of our country, and thanks to modern DNA tests, we're able to see just how much they fathered. So the discussion and debate goes on. Today, we have a young fellow, Milo Yiannopoulos, who staged a free speech week a few days ago, which rather fizzled because it had a very low turnout. Nevertheless, cost the University of California, Berkeley, $800,000 in security because of fears of further violence. And Milo is the kind of fellow who has the kind of speech, or gives the kind of speech which I abhor, because it punches down. It goes after the weak. One of his slogans is, "Feminism is cancer," unquote. He referred to his gathering as the Coachella of conservatism. It was rather less than that. But nevertheless, Milo has a right to speak. And in fact, I'm glad he speaks, because I think he demeans himself by his own speech. That his own argument is so self-destructive. This was what kept me going for many years on the McLaughlin Group. But the great irony of that, and I thank you very much for that plug for the program, I've been very gratified by the kind of response we've gotten from viewers around the country. I thought the show was kind of old hat, because everybody shouts at each other on talk shows now. But I started doing McLaughlin Group back in 1988. It'll be 30 years ago next year. And after his death, at his funeral, I learned something about where the theory of the show came from. One of his friends pointed out that John's vision for the show was 4 or 5 old friends who meet together once a week at a sidewalk cafe, and they have their favorite beverages, and they argue about politics and current events feverishly, getting almost embarrassingly cutting and biting sometimes. But in the end, they part as friends and say, "See you next week." That little simple concept, I think, is why, after years of being ridiculed by my friends for participating in, quote, the shouting show, now I hear people come up to me and say, "Boy, I missed that show. You had such civil discussions." You had both right and left on the show, not just one side. And you talked and you argued and you got your words in, but they were tight and concise. And in the end, I look forward to seeing you all again the next week. That's the kind of rapport that you really can't buy at a store when you put a TV show on. And I appreciate John in so many more ways than I appreciated him back when he was alive. I mean, I've had so many people say, how can you stand doing that program? And I say, well, 2 reasons, fame and fortune. I mean, after all, when my son was 10 years old, we got lampooned in Mad Magazine. What more could a young man ask for in life? I was such a hit with the fifth graders at my son's school. You can't buy that anywhere. We're in an age now where people wonder what's happened to civility, what has happened to our ability to talk to each other in a civil manner. It is the obligation, as my son reminds me all the time, of younger generations to shock their elders. And I am recently shocked by a survey perhaps you all read about, which came from the Brookings Institution, looking at the attitudes of today's college students. According to this new study, there's a study of 1,500 undergraduate students at four-year colleges, found that 51% of them thought it was just fine for a student group to loudly and repeatedly disrupt, quote, a very controversial speaker who is known for making offensive and hurtful statements, unquote, so the audience cannot hear him or her. 1/5, 19%, of undergraduates surveyed said it's okay to use physical force to silence a speaker who makes, quote, offensive and hurtful statements, unquote. And 40% of the students said the First Amendment does not protect hate speech. Spoiler alert, ladies and gentlemen, it does. This study was conducted by John Villasenor, a senior fellow at Brookings and a public policy professor at UCLA. But his is not the first to find such a trend. A 2016 Gallup poll found that 78% of students said schools should promote an environment that exposes them to a range of viewpoints. However, 69% believe universities should restrict speech that was, quote, intentionally offensive to certain groups, unquote. And a Pew Research Center survey 2 years ago found millennials are far more likely than older generations to say the government should be able to prevent people from making offensive statements about minority groups. Now, these are not insane opinions. These are opinions that actually are quite rational depending on how you were raised. However, it is certainly in the American tradition, legally, constitutionally, and otherwise, for us to believe that the best response to offensive speech is more speech. The best response to speech that you don't agree with is more speech. Give the other side. Give alternative views. Have a real dialogue. Be able to come to some kind of synthesis, if you will, between the premise and the antithesis. This is the kind of atmosphere that I appreciated back when I was in college, and I'd like to see more of that today. I think we all would, and as a result, I'm very happy we're having this discussion today. I am going to get things rolling by asking each of our panelists a question to get their thoughts, and then give an opportunity for panelists to respond to each other, and hopefully move the dialogue along. I'm in that interest of equal time, I am going to turn to, Rick Essenberg. Can't think of a better person to follow me and my classic liberal establishment viewpoint than for you to come and tell me where I'm wrong and give us some other perspective. The question I'd like to put to you is, as you just heard, according to my son, free speech is now associated with racist and right-wing attacks today. Was this connection purposeful by the right? That is actually a question from one of the students, but it's one that we've argued back and forth in our house. Let me ask you what you think of that.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I appreciated your comments about the way that these issues played out differently 40 to 50 years ago, when it was a speech on the left on campus that was attempted to be suppressed. And the problem I have with your son's formulation of the issue, and I'm sure he's a very intelligent young man, is that...
Of course, look where he came from.
Is that what I say. The problem is that our traditional notions, Western notions of freedom of speech, are not an effort to entrench power, but they are an appreciation of the way in which power can be abused. The notion that error has no rights has a long history in human civilization, and it's a quite bloody history, because human beings have a tendency to come to believe that everything with which they disagree is error. And so the price we pay to check power and to check the abuse of power is to tolerate points of view with which we disagree. College is a perfect place to learn how to do that. It's a place where your presuppositions are supposed to be challenged. It's not a place where you're supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be a place where you begin to encounter ideas that are different than your own. And it's important that you learn to do that because the world is not a safe space. And people will not always think like you do. And they will not always believe that, that your security and your peace of mind requires them to conform their thinking to yours. But there's a caution, right? There's a qualification to all of that. And I think it's a caution that right now, in the present moment, I particularly want to repeat to many of my friends on the right. And that is to say that you're for freedom of speech and to say that you're against political correctness is not a warrant for incivility. You can't enforce civility particularly well by coercion or by a centralized set of rules. But what you can do is contribute a culture of civility, one that says, I'm willing to listen to you without calling you names, and in exchange for that, I want you to listen to me. And as a Panther, class of 78, spent a lot of time working with the University Legal Clinic up on the 3rd floor, and I have to admit a lot of time sleeping in the chairs on the 2nd floor here in the Union. I'm really gratified to see my alma mater hold a discussion like this, and thank you for coming and leading it.
Well, thank you for hosting me, Rick. I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn to Chris Ott from the dreaded ACLU. According to my friends who watch Fox News. But to put the same question to you, why has free speech become associated with the right these days, in your opinion? Especially, I'm talking about young people in particular, like my son and a couple of students who contributed questions along those lines.
That's a tough one to answer, and I guess I'm not sure that I agree that it's become associated with the right. And I mean, if anything, I think that this is something that has played out for a long time throughout our history, and you know, the ACLU is an organization that's been around for 100 years, almost 100 years now, and so we've seen this in various forms. You know, I think that what we're seeing today is sort of multivaried and not that much different from debates that we've seen in the past. But I think that the most important thing to keep in mind are, you know, sort of the big picture principles. You know, we take the view that the framers of our Constitution didn't make it the First Amendment for nothing. You know, freedom of expression gives us power to defend other rights that we are all supposed to have as Americans. It helped in the creation of our country and our government. It's helped us to correct or to put a stop to some of the worst wrongs in our country's history, including slavery, preventing whole categories of people to vote, and even today, in this you know, situation that we're in, I mean, I hope that we all feel lucky to live in a time when people are so inventive in finding ways to use their First Amendment rights, whether that is taking place online or protesting pipelines or kneeling during the national anthem before a game. I think there's just a lot going on, and it's challenging and it's uncomfortable sometimes, but I think it's really interesting and important.
Does the name Robert Mercer mean anything to you?
I don't think that's the same.
Let me just ask a show of hands, just people who know who Robert Mercer is. a few scattered around here and there. Robert Mercer is a hedge fund billionaire who, along with his wife, funded Breitbart News. They funded Cambridge Analytics, a well-known and controversial political data collection firm, and they funded the campaign of a candidate for president named Donald Trump, and have continued to be closely involved with Steve Bannon, now that he's back over at Breitbart. And BuzzFeed recently reported, and I know this is a new age when I'm citing a website called BuzzFeed, but they get a lot of interesting scoops. One of them is that Bob Mercer has been heavily funding Milo Yiannopoulos, as well as other campus conservatives, or I should say conservatives who speak on campus or seek to speak on campuses. And what's this alt-right founder, Richard Sterling is the name of it? I'm sorry?
Richard Spencer?
Well, I'm sorry, Richard Spencer. Thank you very much. I'm an old man, but the files are up here. It just takes me longer to go through them. Richard Spencer, who's been on a publicity wave in recent months, heavily funded by a number of conservative benefactors, including the Mercers. And I think that might be one reason why so many college students who do live in a world different from us older folks have come to associate free speech with the right. Do you two gentlemen think that might have something to do with that?
It's hard for me to say. I think I would disagree. I would disagree because I think that, and I always say when somebody asks me to talk about Donald Trump, I always say that during the election last year, my team, which is sort of the classically liberal conservative movement, the one that was represented by Reagan, we didn't make the playoffs last year. We didn't really have a candidate in the election. And
You're talking about the thinking conservatives.
Well, I would go beyond that because I actually think that what we're seeing in the Trump movement is actually an ideological challenge to what the conservative movement has been traditionally been. This is not simply a matter of style. It is not simply a matter of not thinking. It's a matter of actually supporting a different set of policies, which in some ways would move the Republican Party to the left. But I think that the reason that free speech on campus has been associated with the right is the same reason that free speech on campus in the 60s was associated with the left. And that is because the campuses in the 50s and the 60s were dominated by the right, and they attempted to suppress the speech of the left. Campuses today are dominated by the left, and they will try to suppress the speech of the right, because this is not because conservatives are bad or liberals are good or vice versa. This is because what human beings do. When they have power, they tend to abuse it. And that is why the First Amendment, and I think I agreed with everything you said, Chris. I mean, this is a wonderful moment, is...
Let's put a star on the calendar for today, ladies and gentlemen.
There's a reason that the First Amendment is the first one, because it is the most essential check on the abuse of power that we have.
Thank you. Want to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that what you're getting at, the money that's behind that's funding some of these groups and some of these speakers adds a layer to this. I mean, we're not only talking about the sort of textbook case of one view versus another, people just sort of saying what they believe on their own. I mean, there are well-financed groups that are making some of this happen. So that's something that requires some thought, certainly, and I think that in a lot of ways the First Amendment provides an answer to that too, because it when people have the right to speak and express themselves freely, they can call that sort of thing out and point to the funding that particular groups or speakers may get, that sort of thing. I mean, I think that the First Amendment gives us a tool that is still really, especially relevant today.
Well, let me turn to Bridget Keyes. I'm really eager to hear your response to this. You, of course, are specialists in LGBT studies. You've seen the various diversity issues play out on campus and elsewhere. What are your thoughts when you hear this kind of argument going on about what should be allowed to be spoken on campus versus what should not?
Yeah, so I'm really lucky to work with the LGBT student population pretty extensively. So we do tend to be dominated by thoughts on the left. And one of the things that I do when I start each semester is try to cultivate what I call safe space for dangerous ideas. So I have various games and activities intended to create a culture where we feel that we all respect each other, that we understand that we're here to have civil discourse. And if we can create that culture, then we can encounter ideas that are maybe the opposite of what values we think we hold, ideas that we don't want to encounter, ideas that might seem threatening to our morality. So that's the culture that I try to craft in my classes. But you know, the concern that weighs heavily on my mind as an LGBT identified person and someone who works with these students is that I can't control that environment outside the classroom. So I've had students who were doxxed, that is, their names and identities were revealed publicly on the web, leading to students being afraid to come to campus because they were identified as UWM students and they felt that they would be either subject to violence or harassment once they arrived here. Trans students have been dead named, which is their incorrect name was used to identify them rather than the correct name that corresponds to their true gender identity. And it's really hard to think that these abstract notions of free speech that I have, that I hold very dear, which are not that different than Riggs, though we might politically be really different. It's very hard to hold those ideas in abstract and actually look at a student who's been subject to violence and say, you're just a victim of the First Amendment, get over it, that's the price we pay. So this is a question that weighs really heavily on my mind. How do I look at a student and say, this is acceptable?
Well, how do you look at a student and tell them this is acceptable? I mean, like the line I just quoted from Milo Yiannopoulos, feminism is cancer.
Yeah.
Not very funny, by the way. I mean, he's supposed to be a comedian.
It's not funny to feminism or cancer. So I don't know. I mean, one of the activities that I'll just pivot and tell you what I do.
Okay.
So one of the things that I tend to do at the start of the semester is give out the University of Chicago Dean's letter to incoming first-year students from last fall, which said, the University of Chicago does not support the idea of safe spaces or trigger warnings. That's not the culture we want to create here. And I asked my students to consider where that letter might be coming from. What climate or concerns does the administration have that might be encouraging that? And what ways do we think that they might be misunderstanding the value of creating a safe culture on campus in order to engage in critical thinking? So I try to strike a balance where we understand that we might hear things we don't like, but it's our job as students, as scholars, to address them with logic and dispassion and critical thinking.
Oh, well, I wish you well with that.
I'm not sure if I actually accomplished that, but that's the goal, right?
I find logic, dispassion, and critical thinking work very well with everybody but my own son, but that's something else again. Anyway, let me turn to Michelle Bria. Michelle, you deal with a very diverse community, and you deal with a lot of K through 12 youngsters, and much of what I've talked about, like I said before, it depends on how you were raised, what kind of attitude you have toward free speech or toward diversity, toward people's feelings, et cetera, et cetera. What do you tell young people who are budding and growing up? What do you tell them? What would you advise we tell them about free speech or offensive speech?
Well, at Journey House, we partner with the International Association for Human Values in a program called YES, Youth Empowerment Seminar, Teaching Advanced Breathing to Manage Stress. And I think what happens with free speech is we've developed, we don't teach that art of discourse and disagreement anymore. And so what happens is when a young person or an older person, we're human beings, are sensitive, and we don't agree with what the other person is saying, we've come to a society or in our community that if someone's looked at the wrong way, they could get shot or died. You know, it's very intense. And there's no management of emotions, and that if you allow people to push your buttons, and there's no knowledge of what that other, understanding what that other person is doing, it can lead to very deadly consequences and traumatic. And so what we do is we really believe in bringing people to that awareness of, you know, we button-proof people. And so you even see it at recess. Like, you're not going to let someone else push your buttons. But what that is doing is teaching listening, is teaching understanding, because it's very easy to go to the negative, and it's very easy to condemn someone because they don't view things the way you view them, or you know, they upset you, and so they're pushing your buttons, and so it's very easy to go that way. But it's very hard to have that courage to be compassionate and understand the other side. I really think we live in an era that no matter, that cuts across income class, it cuts across all the different isms, that we want to, and rightly so as parents, protect our children's feelings, have that protection of feelings, but with that comes not the creation of that thick skin, and you know, that's the sensitivity that can, now it's not just say young person against young person, it's young person against a teacher who's trying to teach them. And feeling you have the right not only to speech, but my right to like hit a teacher and cross that line to violence. And so working with young people and, you know, just teaching them how to manage their emotions. And human beings are very complicated, and it's a very complicated, very, very complicated situation.
Yeah, especially if you're in the 8th grade or whatever.
If you're in the 8th grade, I think it's very hard as a young person, especially in those teenage years. But then when you come to a wonderful campus, when you get to, everyone has their bubble, whether you're in the near South Side bubble or you come from whatever bubble you come from. When you come onto a campus, now you hear a diversity of speeches. And maybe in the neighborhood you handled it in a certain way, but on campus or in the corporate world, you're not going to be able to handle it. And so we try to teach that civility, and we teach that civility through kind of relationship building and building strong relationships, and using incentives such as sports or athletics or the arts or theater, things that young people are interested in, to pull them in so that we can help. Help.
Well, we've all done an excellent job of being very civil. I thank you very much. I'm going to turn to a genuine philosophy professor now. Blaine, can you help to make some sense out of all this for us here with, are we on the right track? Are we having the right discussion about speech within the boundaries of that which does not lead to violence, or to flip it around, the Antifa question, is violence okay to stop speech that you think is going to be dangerous?
I don't think violence is okay to stop speech.
Good. Well, we got that established.
So that's an easy question to answer. I do think, you know, there's some borderline cases, I guess, if you're shedding fire in a crowded theater, to use a classic example, you can maybe tackle. Unless
there is a fire.
Fair enough.
Everybody forgets that part. You know?
Right. So I do think, though, that we need to, I think in terms of the debate over free speech, we need to have a bit of a reality check, in that we live in a world where there's never been more free speech. People can say whatever they want online. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's blogs, there's editorials, there's the internet. There is a surfeit of speech, some of it very vile, some of it very aggressive, some of it wonderful, excellent. So it's not as if there's a lack of speech. Now, one of the worry that you're raising, I think, is about controversial speakers invited to universities. And there I do think that there is a First Amendment right at public universities of free speech for invited speakers. There's no way around that. It's a good thing most of the time, and so it should be respected. But I do think that simply because you have a right to do something, so if a student group has the right to invite someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, doesn't mean that you shouldn't exercise that right responsibly. So people have a right of free speech to lie, short of fraud. People have a right of free speech to insult others. But those aren't, certain exercises of free speech are not morally helpful or right. And I think we need to situate the university, understand it as an association with a particular mission. It's not Facebook. It's not Twitter. It is not a free-for-all for people to shout and scream and say whatever they want. A university is an association that is committed to the structured investigation and dissemination of knowledge. And so I think that student groups and other organizations who make use of the public space that a university provides should exercise discretion in deciding whom they invite. They should invite people who are going to be supportive of the mission of a university, right? Now, they have the right to invite people who are going to be destructive, the Milos, the Ann Coulters, people who are not interested in positively engaging in ideas, in discussing views calmly and rationally with others. They have that right, but they should think about how they want to exercise that right. And I would suggest that they try to exercise that right by inviting people who will engage in activities like this one, who will calmly and civilly discuss ideas, treat each other with respect, and serve the function of the university. So if the university, if Milo can't speak at a university, I mean, it's not hard to find out what he thinks. If Ann Coulter cancels her talk at Berkeley, it's really easy to figure out what Ann Coulter, her views are. I mean, I wish I could filter them out. I try to. But it's not as if there's a problem in terms of finding out what these people think. Rather, as a member of a university community, I think we should think about how we exercise the rights that we have, the rights to free speech that we have, in ways that further the goals of the university, further intelligent discussion, further debate on important topics.
Let me press you a little bit there, because we're talking here in the real world about speakers who are invited not by the university per se, but very often by student organizations. Number one, should a student organization have the right to invite whoever they want to a university facility, including state universities that are public property? And should you limit yourself to inviting people whose views you don't know? I mean, you just said we already have other ways to find out. I mean, I know too much about what Ann Coulter believes, as far as I'm concerned, as well as Milo and the rest. But I'm not going to stand in the way of if somebody wants to invite them to campus. And in most of the cases I know of, it was like the Campus Young Republicans, for example, or one of those rare student conservative groups, which are harder to find now than there might have been in the past. But nevertheless, I personally think that they ought to have that right. How do you feel about that?
Sure, yes, they should have that right, and they do have that right. So all I'm doing is imploring them to use that right responsibly. I mean, people have the right to make up utter falsehoods, right? And insult each other. That's all protected. But I don't think that's a constructive way of exercising one's right. So yes, they have that right. If they choose to exercise it that way, then I respect that exercise. But I would ask them to think about whether they are furthering the mission of a university in doing so. And are they actually doing something that's constructive for their own view? I don't think inviting a provocateur actually makes others more sympathetic to conservative views. I think it has precisely the opposite effect. So they might want to, even from the point of view of self-interest, they might want to think about what they're doing in terms of their inviting. So I think it's very important to distinguish between having a right to do something and exercising that right in a morally responsible way. I think it's a very important distinction.
Well, so you advocate the power of persuasion, really, with these, with the people who invite these speakers.
So if you go to an academic conference as a professor, you can insult people. You can lie. You can claim that you can say whatever you want, but you won't get invited back, right? And you'll have a very poor reputation. So these are informal norms of academic discourse that we maintain. That is conducive to the production and dissemination of knowledge, understanding different points of view. And so I would ask other members of the university, like student groups, to think about why they're on a university, as opposed to simply renting a hall somewhere. As members of a university, that they exercise their rights responsibly, just as most of the time researchers do and scholars do.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to our two fellow veterans here on the panel. I see somebody decided to separate us, which is just as well. Perhaps after walking in the room earlier before the program, and we were all telling war stories here, mostly me, who never went to combat, but nevertheless went through the experience, and the experience of coming back. And for those of you who've been following the Vietnam series, I was drafted late in the war in '69 when everybody was tired of it. And when we would go off post, we would tend to dress in our civilian clothes because we just to avoid harassment or find it easier to meet girls. Excuse me, women. They were girls in those days. But one of the things that gets me is I'm curious as to, for you two, what it's like coming to campus these days in the kind of liberal environment that we have talked about, and where there is no draft now. So the wars themselves, whether Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever, are farther away from day-to-day life over here. And I'd like to know how you feel as veterans on campus today. Do you think it's different than the experience was in my era? And I want to start with Sam Rogers over here to my left.
Thank you. So I guess first I want to make it clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of all veterans, despite being the veteran advocate on campus. A lot of times people hear veterans speak, they will associate that viewpoint with the 1.5 million current service members and 70 million veterans, and it's a very diverse group, so don't hold anybody else to what I say. So I guess my experience is mostly focused on that I spent my entire adult life in an American institution where there were limitations on free speech that were upheld by the Supreme Court. And some of the effects of that despite looking good on paper, a lot of people don't think about. So essentially, the things that we take for granted, or that I can now take for granted as a college student and real people again, are the ability to speak my mind. In the service, you're not given really that protection. And not only are you not given that protection, it's unlike being in a traditional employer where voicing your dissatisfaction with your boss or the political persuasion of your CEO, it doesn't get you necessarily just fired. It also carries with it the threat of force that the government has. It could lead to deprivation of your means to provide for yourself, your freedom, loss of benefits after being separated from the service. They're very real threats to that, to the supposedly politics-free Defense Department. And it doesn't end up being that. Essentially, what is created is echo chambers that reflect your supervisor or your commander. Your commander may tolerate viewpoints openly stated that support his or her own. And those who might think differently will have that limitation of freedom of military expression applied to them. A good example is the don't ask, don't tell policy, where essentially the highest executive commander-in-chief issued a policy that created a circumstance where to speak out against that policy was not allowed, right? It was speaking out against the commander-in-chief executive policy and violated your limitations to military expression. And what that created was an environment where the opposite was naturally, tacitly encouraged, which was anti-LGBT speak and conversations and attitudes. And those things grew there, as was seen with a lot of the resistance to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so mostly I implore people to think about the second and third order effects of wanting to give away some of your constitutionally protected freedoms, because rarely do they work out as good as they may look on paper or in your head. And I like them. I'm new to having this, and so I really enjoy it a lot. It's in that regard, I may not be I'm 30 and I have kids, but I may not be that much different than a 18-year-old coming to this institution where I was excited to finally be able to participate safely in politics and free speech and civil discourse, and I'm not entirely excited about the prospect of that changing.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. Dan Kafka, do you feel somewhat liberated now with as far as the speech issue is concerned on campus?
Somewhat liberated is probably an understatement. It's really, really liberating because you can't, like you already mentioned, you can't even speak ill about the president. If you disagree about the president's views or what the president's doing, that's your own business to stay at home. You don't bring that in the workspace when you're in the military. So coming out into the civilian world, it's fantastic. Sometimes you go over the top when you first get out, and coming to school, I didn't come straight to school after I got out. I went and did the job industry for a little while, and being in that, it was a wake-up call, like, oh, you can't say all the things that you thought you could say. So it's like, it's not so much that you are limited, but you are limited in the military. In the military, you're limited by free speech because you can't say things of political nature. The biggest reason that people want free speech is because they want to be able to talk about their elected officials. You don't get that right in the military, but because you don't have that right, I would say that the experience of at least the small unit level is that you're more cavalier in what you say. You don't care as much about offending each other because you know that you're not truly trying to offend each other. And when you come out of the military, suddenly the things that you say or that you were able to say in the military are now offensive and you don't understand why. So I would say that the biggest challenge besides accepting that freedom, getting out of the military, is understanding how not to abuse that freedom, how to use that freedom appropriately and not go over the top. And coming to university helps you even more. A lot of people, and I'm the same as Sam, I'm not going to speak for all veterans, but I will speak from what I see for veterans. There is still that difficulty trying to understand what we can and cannot say, what we're allowed to say, still trying to understand what is protected speech, what isn't protected speech, and a lot of times it's not explained. A lot of people just get mad right away and they tell you that you're not supposed to say that, they don't give you a reason why, so then you just sit there confused. And one of the things that I like about UWM, which is the college campus in general, is that it is a safe space. Not in the way that safe space has been hijacked where you have to you're not allowed to say anything that's going to offend me. I don't think that's what a safe space at all is. I think a safe space, what we get here at UWM, is the ability to say just about whatever you want to say without fear of somebody punching you in the face or being able to have that civil discourse without having to worry about it turning into a shouting match, which, sometimes it does. But, it just really depends. So I'm not certain if I answered your question all the way, but if someone
let me pursue it a little bit. The military is about the most diverse work environment you can have.
Yes.
right. And when I was back in the 60s, they became aware. Well, guys, that's a story in itself. Diversity in the military. In the early 60s, in the beginning of the Vietnam War, the mortality rate, KIAs killed in action among African Americans was a significantly higher proportion than among whites. This became an issue inside and outside the military. The Pentagon took steps to equalize assignments and risk, and was remarkably effective. Even more seriously, the urban riots going on in our cities in the 60s were also happening in military fashion within the military. Various major fights, outbreaks of violence and conflicts. The Pentagon tackled this head on in dealing with diversity, sensitivity, promotions, fairness, et cetera, and produced the kind of environment that we know today. I'd like to ask each of you, when you talk about how you feel like this is a safe space here, but I know a lot of people in the military who would say, well, that's a safe space there. But I mean, it's a different kind of a society, as you both implied. It's a different society, different standards. When you said something about, you could say something that folks outside might find offensive, but you know that within your group, everybody understands. I've seen more controversies erupt over that when somebody said something that everybody didn't understand, and next thing you know, boom, got a big dust up. But I was just wondering, why do you think the military has been so effective with managing diversity, while we're still arguing and wrestling with it so much in the civilian world?
I think the military has made great strides in managing diversity, certainly. I think it's always a work in progress. But I think it's that there's much more at stake in the military. Drives really, it's the only time anything gets done in the military is if someone's going to die if it doesn't get fixed. And so I think that, especially in a time of conflict, as we've had for the last 16 odd years, I think that has driven the need for that, especially in a all volunteer service where essentially you can't just round people up and have them do everything. People want a diverse experience. It's the only organization with the closest actual representation of the American people. And every single unit I was fortunate enough to be in reflected that. And that's a good experience for a lot of people. It's good exposure, much like I'm sure college is for college students. People taken out of their comfort zones and learn pretty quickly that there's not all that many differences between each other.
I see what you mean. Dan, what do you think?
The best way that they handle diversity, if they are handling it well, is the fact that, at least from the Army standpoint, everybody's green. There's no such thing as a color in the military, so you don't really have to worry about that too much. Certainly there are people that come with their own biases or whatever, but generally speaking, when you get into the military, because it's a volunteer force, they can take everybody they want to, but it reflects more of the United States. And given that the United States doesn't have, I think, as big of the problems that's not the right way to say that. I don't think that some of the problems that are shown in the civilian sector as on the media are as big as they're made to be out. And especially when you get into the military, since we sample from essentially every demographic background in the country, you really see what America is really like. And I don't know, from being in the military, I love what Americans are really like. You see Americans at their worst time being their best, and it's a really fantastic thing. So I would go back to that green thing. It's just the fact that we're all in the same uniform. We all know that we're fighting for the same purpose. When you select the people, you're not selecting people that are trying to get out of being in the military like what was happening in Vietnam. You're selecting people that want to be in the military, that at least have some understanding of the Constitution and are fighting to protect that constitutional right. Whether that's what they end up doing or not in the military is a different story, but that's usually why they start joining the military in the first place. So I think that adds to it a lot.
You had said that it's important that the command come down from the top down, and that sets the standard for how people are going to behave with each other.
Yes and no. I would say that the standard is always set from the top. So in that way, I would agree with you. But since the top is usually not there in the military, I can't say that the standard or the practice is enforced or anything from the top. I think the standard is just relayed by the top, and they say this is how we expect you to act. And then it's lower enlisted soldiers that do the police or airmen or whatever branch it might be that do the policing up of their own people, and they make sure that they're walking the line that they're supposed to be walking. So it's a lot more community-driven efforts to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, to make sure that we're being emblematic of the uniform that we're wearing and things like that. It's not necessarily the fact that we know that from the top down we're going to get in trouble. That does have an effect. Don't get me wrong. You know as well. That definitely has an effect. Right. Knowing that top might come down and get you, but largely it's self-policing.
That's something I've told corporate managers, that it's like one thing the Pentagon taught me was that when the order does come from the top down, you will get along. People get along.
Yeah.
You know, but if it comes from the bottom up, who knows what's going to happen? You know, some platoons will get along better than other platoons will. I want to throw out another question that was given to me by a student, and I want to throw this out to the whole panel, whoever wants to respond. The Republican and Democratic parties appear to be in shambles. What can we do as a nation moving forward to bring all sides to the table in unity? The far right, the far left will all have to meet in the middle at some point. How do we even begin to do this if we can't talk to each other decently? Who wants to take that on?
I got like 5 seconds to say on that. Something like this is a good way to do that because, I don't know, I knew some of the political persuasions of people coming up here because they had told me, but largely I didn't know. And I think that would help the conversation. If you come into the conversation and you know and you're like, I'm alt-left, I'm alt-right. Well, you're probably not going to get along because you already think that you're diametrically opposed. But if you come to the table and you haven't told anybody what your political persuasion is and you just want to listen, now you have the opportunity to actually talk. But as long as you want to throw labels on it and throw labels all around, there's not a single conversation you can see on Facebook right now from one side or the other that doesn't say the right's doing this, the left's doing that, and that's just ridiculous. It's more likely the case that it's not just the right or left, that it's across all spectrums of the United States that are doing it. So I think the best solution to have the conversation is to not bring up what political persuasion you are in the first place, and then have the conversation afterwards. If you want to tell each other, oh, by the way, I'm a socialist, or by the way, I'm a libertarian, or something like that, that's fine. You've already had the conversation, then you can go hate each other later, I guess.
Well, good. Who else wants to respond to that before I start calling names, Rick?
Yeah, I would say this is sort of a rule of thumb. Life is paradoxical. And if you believe that the people who disagree with you are either ignorant, evil, or crazy, you could be right, it might be, but the odds are that they're not, right? The overwhelming odds are that you're probably wrong about assuming that. And so I might disagree politically with Clarence or with Bridget, but I have an obligation to try to understand why you feel the way you do. And it won't be perhaps easy because I'm committed to my perspective. I struggle with confirmation bias the same way that everybody else does. But I ought to try to do it. And it turns out that it's not that hard. It doesn't mean I'll change my opinion, but it means that I might be able to engage you more sympathetically. And I hope that we should follow that rule and try to assume that obligation towards each other.
Indeed. Do you think, Chris, do you think it is actually profitable for the media or for political parties to keep us divided, that they, for parties, it's a better fundraising tool, and for the media, it's a better audience builder, if they can get people to show more conflict than cooperation?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it probably is, and looking out on our political scene today, I would have to say that it's probably working. But I also think that there's hope, or I hope that there's hope, in the sense that the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, and to prove it, we've caused problems for every presidential administration since we were formed. But I see something going on today that I've certainly never seen in my life before, which is I think that people are, some of the almost hourly insults that we've seen from the President of the United States on Twitter, combined with the actual injuries that we're seeing coming from the White House and from elsewhere, against whole groups of people, immigrants, LGBT people, people of color, women. I think that this is jolting people out of a sense of complacency that may have existed before. And certainly we at the ACLU have never seen anything like the surge of support that we've seen over the last 10 months or so, which we're very grateful for. I think people are sort of realizing that there are fundamental American values and ideals at stake, and they are kind of rallying to defend them. So I hope that is what prevails.
Has this been true since Election Day, or did you see it before?
Well, we definitely saw it before the election, but we really saw it after the election. We saw it in the days immediately after the election, and then for instance, when the White House announced the Muslim travel ban, we saw people, web traffic to our sites like we've never seen before. We saw people spontaneously going to airports to sort of rally and show their opposition to the Muslim travel ban and to this kind of religious discrimination. I think that gives me hope.
Well, on the flip side, did I see a headline recently about the ACLU will no longer defend gun rights or gun rights cases?
Well, no. There has been a lot.
Might have been fake news.
I think probably what you're referring to is that after Charlottesville, when we took a sort of traditional First Amendment stand, and we did defend the right of the person who applied for the permit in Charlottesville. But then given how that actually played out, the violence that we saw there, I think that we are going to take, we're probably going to continue to take that stand. We always have, we probably always will. But I think that we're going to take a closer look at these kinds of situations in the future. In Charlottesville, it wasn't actually gun violence that took someone's life. But we're going to look at that in the future. I mean, we are in this, we're in this situation now where so many states have open carry laws, and guns and other weapons bring a new element of danger and volatility to this question. And it's hard to exercise your First Amendment rights when you're staring at people who are heavily armed.
Bridget, do you think we have, things, we're doing a better job now of recognizing different groups on campus and enabling free speech, or are we starting to get into our cocoons?
That's a great question. I mean, I've been playing the higher ed game for about 10 years now, and it does feel like there's been a shift in that time. So I'd be curious to get the opinion of a colleague who's been around longer to see if they feel like it's even more entrenched. I kind of want to build on what Rick was saying, though, about this unwillingness to encounter the opposite because you see the opposing side as immoral or evil. And I think that's true, but I also think that part of it is we're afraid that by encountering the other side, it'll weaken our own opinion. And I think one way to sort of solve this problem is by, from an education standpoint, again, making it clear to students that actually when you encounter someone whose value system doesn't align with yours, that doesn't make yours weaker. It actually helps you sharpen your own political views, your values, your religious beliefs, because you know what to ping them off of, right? So I think the more that we can teach people that you have to have a contrast to understand your own values, I think the more willing we will be to listen to each other.
And arguing effectively helps you to sharpen your own argument more and become more knowledgeable and effective, right?
Right.
That's what I learned in my membership on the Tribune editorial board. It does help, and for that matter, McLaughlin Group too. So we all should be so fortunate as to have such educated people argue with. Well, what do you think about that? What I just asked in terms of different groups? Are we getting pulling back into our cocoons more now?
At the community level and the neighborhood level?
Yeah.
I really think, going back to all these questions, that the bottom line is that relationship building and learning how to listen and listen without defense, to really hear what other people are saying, and to, we have so much work to do in our community. It's heavy lifting, and we have amazing, bright, shining stars that have so much energy and inspiring, and we need positive adults that are just circulating and supporting them. But we have to help we always say we have to develop our adults to develop our kids, because our kids are going to do what they see, not what we say. And so it's really important to have those positive role models through our coaches, our mentors, our teachers, our instructors, and the more, if anyone's looking for something to do, there's plenty to do at Journey House in our neighborhood, because we have thousands of kids. But really, it's really those positive adults that are circulating them every day and building those relationships and listening without defense. Because in teenage years, when adults speak, no matter who they are or no matter what party, they just hear the wah, 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 And when you can teach them to listen, and sometimes you need to hear 100 things from 100 different people, that's where we're going to build. And we talk a lot about this at Journey House now, still from Coach Brown. It really is a national defense issue. We need to build our community. We need to build our young people, because the stronger we make our neighborhoods, the stronger we make our community, stronger Milwaukee, stronger Wisconsin, stronger United States.
Very good. Blaine, I got a question here that from a student that seems to be tailor-made for you. Free speech is an ethical tool. How do we define ethics when it appears no one knows how or what political ethics are?
No one knows?
Or at least the student didn't know.
Well, I mean...
This reminds me of President Trump saying, who knew healthcare would be so complicated?
Yes, right.
Well, anyway, go ahead.
So what was the question again?
Yeah, how do we define ethics? Or I think what they mean is how do we act on ethics or behave ethically when it appears that no one knows what political ethics are?
Well, I think that lots of people know what political ethics are, but they choose not to comply or conform to them. We know what it is to treat people with respect. We know what it is to be polite, to listen, to respond to the substance of what they say, even if we end up disagreeing. These things are pretty straightforward. But we live in a world facilitated by wonderful innovations in technology, but in a world where these norms where there's a certain thrill to violating norms of mutual respect, a certain exhilaration to trolling one's opponents, to being a provocateur. Now, hopefully, this will eventually die down. I don't know, maybe 10,000 years from now. But the novelty of violating norms of civil discourse will perhaps subside. And this is not a new thing, right? If you go back, if you look at the history of political life, you'll see times when it's very respectful and people engage with one another in a civil manner. And you see times in which people start violating these norms and being rude, saying outrageous things, mocking people, denigrating them. And so I hope that eventually that we'll see a movement back towards norms of civility, norms of mutual engagement. One thing that I think could help is using institutions to facilitate respectful debate, right? So I have a kind of a debating background. You know, when I was at Oxford, I engaged in parliamentary style debates. And what I loved about those exchanges that you had two opposing teams, but you had rules structuring how long they could speak. They could rise on points of order, points of personal privilege if they were being insulted. You had a speaker to adjudicate these disputes. But then the aim of the debate was to respond to the substance of the arguments of your opponent. Right? And so the rules actually, the discipline of those rules actually facilitated the free exchange of ideas, the evaluation of arguments. So certainly I think a university is uniquely qualified to promote those kinds of activities, to invite visitors who are willing to engage in a formal debate with one another on opposing sides. Now, it's not necessarily at the end of the day that one side is going to convince the other, but at least there'll be a deeper level of mutual understanding. Sometimes people are convinced, so I don't want to rule that out. I've changed my view once, so it's possible. But I do think that it's important that using institutions, the problem with things like Facebook and Twitter and inviting provocateurs who are simply going to identify individual students and mock them and things like that, is that there's no discourse. There's no structure to the exchange of ideas. You're simply screaming. And trolling and insulting one another. So if you have rules like parliamentary style debates where you advance position, is the position of our team, of the government, the X, and you provide a number of reasons for it, and then the opposition gets up and tries to refute those reasons, then I think that is a way to promote the free exchange of ideas without prejudicing or censoring the content of the ideas in any way.
Very good. I'm getting the whistle blown on me here, which is only appropriate. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank all of you and our audience today for joining us. And some of these folks are going to hang around so we get a chance to chat more informally after the program. I just want to close by reminding us of why we are all here, to hopefully build a better society, hopefully help us all to work together more. A goal which reminds me of what Dr. Martin Luther King said about 50 years ago, just before he was taken away from us, that we all have a task, and let us all go out and do it with a divine dissatisfaction. Let us be dissatisfied as long as there's a wealth of creeds and a poverty of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied as long as the inner city the outer city of wealth and hope is separated from the inner city of poverty and despair. Let us be dissatisfied until the lion can lie down with the lamb and none shall be afraid. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when there's no white power, there's no black power, but there's only God's power and human power. Those words have kept me going over the years, especially when I think about how the lion does need to lie down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get much sleep. So that's kind of where we are today. With that in mind, let us remember what the country preacher said, that what your mind can conceive and your heart can believe, your body can achieve. So keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Thank you very much.